Ezekiel 33:3.
All right, welcome to today's Sabbath study. Today we're going to be taking a look at Egypt and the Bible. Where's the history? So it's when you're reading about the Exodus, actually we're just getting to the Exodus in our Bible studies. But once you're approaching this theme of the Exodus, obviously we have a lot of history that we could take a look at outside of the Bible and kind of see if we can overlap those two worlds. So obviously, since the Bible is a book that's based on not stories, it's based on truth. It's not a bunch of mythologies like the Greeks. It's actually based on real living people. We should be able to identify some of these people in Egypt and then find some of their remains. So today we're going to focus on the Egyptian dynasties, and we'll go through every single Egyptian dynasty. So the oldest one being the first, and the latter ones being like the 28th dynasty. I'll show you some of the major milestones in those different dynasties, and then how they overlap with the Exodus. I'll even point out who was the pharaoh, or at least a couple presumptions as to who was the pharaoh that was washed away in the book of Exodus. Before I get started with that, though, I want to make sure that everyone's terminology is up to par. A lot of people misuse these different words. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use every term that identifies this group that we call Israelites or Jews or Hebrews. I want to introduce you to all the words that are used in the Bible to refer to them. And then we're going to know how to use them in the right context during the right time period. I see people, including myself in the past, I'd used the word Hebrew in the wrong spot, Jew in the wrong spot, Israelite in the wrong spot. So we're just going to do a quick review as to what those words mean, the context of how they're used. So that way, when we use them throughout this lesson and future lessons, we'll all be on the same page. So first off, where do we get the word Semite from? When we talk about people that are Semites, or a Semitic religion, or a Semitic faith, or a Semitic language. The word Semite, it comes from Sem, which is Greek. And if you'll notice underneath the Greek Sem, you'll see the word Shem, S-H-E-M. From modern Latin, Semita, Latin, Greek, Sem, son of Noah in the Bible, from whom these peoples were traditionally supposed to be descended. So when we talk about Semites, if we talk about Semites that are blood Semites, we mean people that are blood related to Shem. So Noah had 3 children. One was called Japheth, one was called Ham, and one was called Shem. If we take a look here, here's a Greek alphabet chart on the left. On the right is the Hebrew alphabet. If you notice that the letter Shin is where the arrow is. Shin is a Hebrew alphabet letter that has an SH sound. So you get a sh from the Shin. And if you take a look on the left-hand side at the chart, the closest that the Greeks could do to replicating the sound was with the letter sigma. So if you take a look where S is, sigma is where you get the Semite sound, sigma, Semite. And except the name wasn't Sem, the name was Shem. So since the Greeks and the Romans weren't able to replicate the SH sound, the word sh became sa. And so Shemite became Semite. It's important to point this out because today we have groups of people that identify as Semites. So for example, Islam, everyone who's a follower of Muhammad, they're from an Abrahamic faith. They're sons of Abraham. Abraham was a son of Shem, which means that the Islamic faith is a Semitic religion. So they are Semitic peoples. If we take a look at the Jews were also sons of Shem because Jew came from Judah, which we'll find a little bit later. But again, we have 2 Semites. We have Arabs, right? We have so the descendants of Ishmael. We have they're the Semites, and then we also have the Jews. They're also Semites. We also have Semitic religions such as Christianity, which meaning that you follow the same God as the God of Shem. So the God of Shem was the Lord. The Lord we find in the New Testament is Christ. And so the Christians, while they're not Semitic in regards to their lineage, they're not related to Abraham, they are Semitic in their faith. So when we hear things like anti-Semite, now we start to have an idea as to what that means. So you'll never hear anyone in the Middle East, at least, pointing fingers from Jerusalem over to somewhere like Lebanon and calling everyone anti-Semite. And the reason why is they can't. The people that are living in Lebanon, being followers of Muhammad and being connected to Ishmael, they are Semites too. So it'd be calling it's the pot calling the kettle black. So with that in mind, let me just point out something very interesting. If the story about Noah and the ark is a bunch of baloney, we have a real historical problem. We have over 4 billion people in the world today that identify as a Semite. They either identify as a Semite through their religion, or they identify as a Semite through who they're related to. So through Abraham up to Shem. Now, here's the problem. If we have 4 billion people that associate that they have some kind of a connection to this person named Shem, well, then Noah better exist because we have 4 billion people that believe in someone who has a father that's imaginary. So, kind of interesting, right? Like you look at the story of Noah's Ark, you think, oh, it's just some kind of children's story. But you have to remember when 4 billion people identify as being Semites, what you're saying is that Shem had no father, right? Because in your mind, Noah didn't exist. So, something to keep in mind. So the word Shemite became Semite with the Greek alphabet and Latin. It's because they couldn't make that SH sound. So where did we get the word Hebrew from? So we've talked about a Shemite or a Semite. Now we're going to look at another word. What's a Hebrew? Where did they start using the word Hebrew? Where did that show up? Genesis 14:13 is the very first place in the Bible you'll see the word Hebrew. Then one who escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner. These were allies of Abram. So this is the very first place in the entire Bible where we see the word Hebrew, but we don't know what it means yet. We see that Abram is called a Hebrew. If we take a look at this word Hebrew, it actually goes to Ibri. And Ibri, it says, descendant of Eber. So when we take a look here, this word Eber is a descendant of Shem. So now if we take a look at the lineage, we can see from Noah, we have Shem, and that's where we get Semite. And then if we go down the family lines through Afrix, Selah, and now we have Eber. The word Hebrew is coming from the word Eber. So we have Semites or Shemites, which are coming from Shem, and we have Hebrews, which are coming from Eber. Could we call Salah an Eber? Or sorry, could we call Salah a Hebrew? No, because the first time that Hebrew was being used was for the sons of Eber. So anyone following Eber, we could call a Hebrew. Anyone before Eber, we can't call a Hebrew, but we could call them a Shemite. So the word Hebrew comes from Eber. A Hebrew is a son of Eber. So if we look here, we can see Eber, region beyond, a descendant of Shem, also the name of several Israelites. But if you look, you'll notice that Eber, or Hebrew, it has a root word which is abar. Interestingly enough, the word abar means to pass over. And when you think of the Hebrews and you think of Passover, I'm pretty sure one thing comes to mind, which is that whole flight that happened in the Exodus. So interesting root. It's when you study Hebrew words, you'll find that through, I'm not sure if this is some kind of a spiritual guidance or what, but it just happened to be that a lot of the root words in Hebrew seem to further explain things that are kind of profound about the words that they support. So where did we get the word Israelite from? So again, let's take a look at our lineage from Noah to Abraham. So we looked at Noah, we looked at Shem, where we got Shemite. Eber is where we got Hebrew. And if we keep going down, we have Nahor, Terah, then we go to Abram. From Abram, we'll go Sarah, and then Isaac, and then Rebekah, and then Jacob. Jacob is Israel. So when we talk about an Israelite is a son of Jacob. When we talk about a Hebrew is a son of Eber. When we talk about a Shemite is a son of Shem. Genesis 35:10. And God said to him, though your name is Jacob, you will no longer be called Jacob. Instead, your name will be Israel. So God named him Israel. So again, Israel is not a place, Israel is a person. And we can see that repeated in Genesis 32:28. That's actually the first time it shows up. And Genesis 35 is actually talking about Genesis 32 from a different perspective. So we have our 12 tribes of Israel. These are our Israelites, or we can call them our Jacobites, because the father was called Jacob. So whether you say Israel or Israelites or Jacobites, it's all the same thing. So we have Jacob with his 4 wives, Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah, and Rachel. And then these 12 children. These 12 children are Israel, or Israelites, or Jacobites. Where do we get the word Jew from? Again, we take a look at our 12 tribes of Israel. So going down through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, now we're specifically looking at a specific tribe. So if we look at Leah had a child called Judah. Judah is where we're getting the word Jew from. Now, in the future, we find that people start taking this word and misusing it. Still to this day, it's very misused, and I'll explain the reason why. If you take a look at Judah, Judah is the word Yehuda. So Yehuda is the southern kingdom of Israel. And if you notice, it has a word origin, and the word origin is probably from yada. So I took a look at the word yada, but also the word Yehudi. If you look here, you can see Yehuda. Yehuda is Judah. Yehudi is where you're getting the word Judean or Jews. So you can see that the word Jew is based off of the word Judah or Yehuda. So let's take a look from Judah to Christ, because Judah's the bloodline where Christ was born. So we took a look and we went back from Abraham through Isaac through Jacob. Jacob had his 12 sons. One of those 12 sons through Leah was Judah. And then Judah had a child with Shua. Shua was a Canaanite woman, 2 children actually, and Onan. We've been reading about them in our Wednesday Bible studies. And Onan were they both died. Onan was supposed to be promised in marriage to Tamar, another Canaanite, except he died before he was promised in marriage, and his brother was supposed to have children on his behalf, and instead he was putting a seed on the ground. Lot had 2 children. There's a typo here. So Lot's 2 children were Moab and Ben-Ami. So Moab is where you get Ruth, and Ruth was a Moabite. Later in the Bible, we see a gentleman named Boaz and the book of Ruth. So Ruth is a Moabite, and she comes into the family of Israel, and she comes in through Boaz. So from Tamar and Judah have children. These were twins. So we were studying these on our Wednesday Bible studies. The 2 twins were Perez and Zerah. One child was about to come out first, and then Perez burst out before the other child. Perez is where we find the bloodline of Christ. So from Perez, we go to Salmon. Salmon had a wife called Rahab. Rahab was a Canaanite as well. Then from Salmon, we go to Boaz. Boaz was married to a Moabite, which was Ruth. And then from Boaz, we go to King David. And then from King David, Solomon, and Solomon was married to Bathsheba. And then from Solomon, we have Jesus. So we're missing some points in between here. I think I might have another typo with Bathsheba, but let's just pay attention to actually just the line where the king comes through. We have so many lineages between Christ and Abraham, and they're actually communicated to us in the New Testament. But Judah is the bloodline where Christ comes through. When we take a look in the New Testament, in Matthew in chapter 1 and Luke in chapter 3, it actually gives us a complete breakdown all the way to Christ from Adam. So when we look at the book of Luke chapter 3, we can start at Adam and then start carrying our way down through David and then through Nathan. And Nathan is going to show us Joseph's bloodline. And then if we go on the other side through Solomon, through Rehoboam, eventually we'll go down and we'll get to Joseph, but not Joseph, mother of Christ. We're talking about the father of Mary, the grandfather of Jesus. There's another Joseph. So there's 14 generations listed between Abraham to David, 14 generations listed from David to Babylon. So when the Jews went into captivity, there was 14 generations from King David to when they went in captivity. When they came out of captivity, there was 14 generations from where they were captive in Babylon. This was around like 585 BC. And then this takes us to the birth of Christ. So when we take a look at this word yada, and yada was connected to the word Judah, yada means to throw or cast. And then some other words that associate with it are confess and give praise. So again, as I mentioned, Hebrew words, typically when they have a root, the root word has some kind of a profound hidden meaning behind it, I find sometimes. In this case, it almost seems like the word Judah coming from yada. When we talk about confessing, who do we confess our sins to? We confess our sins to God. We confess our sins to Christ. And then who do we give praise? Well, we only give praise to God. We give praise to Christ. So here it's quite interesting to see that the word Judah, the root of it is yada, and yada means to give praise and confess. And this was the bloodline where Christ was born into. We had Israel that was divided. So Israel had a north kingdom and Israel had a south kingdom. Remember, we're still talking about where the word Jew came from. When we take a look at Judah, we said that's where Jew came from. But something interesting happened. When the kingdom split into 2 halves, the north half was called Israel. And eventually Israel was taken captive. This northern kingdom was taken captive by Assyria. So they were taken, you can see here the word Samaria. Samaria is where you get Samaritans. They were taken up and north past Lebanon, up past Damascus, and then taken around Haran, if you remember, from where Abraham had left his journeys before he came into Shechem, into Canaan. And then from Haran, they moved into Nineveh. Nineveh, you'll see written in the Bible. Ashur, you'll also see written in the Bible, and the Tigris River. And then they went all the way down to Media. You'll notice Media is spelled the exact same way as Media. I think I've brought up before that the witches and sorcerers in Medea, what they would do is they would put on plays. If one king wanted to take over another empire, what he would do is he would send the sorcerers of Medea to go down to that kingdom. They would spend 50 to 100 years putting on plays. And this is what their tactic was. First, they would start off with just plays to entertain people. And then they would start to introduce women into their plays. And then the women would start wearing less clothing. And then they would depict things that were quite provocative. And then what would happen is after 50 to 100 years of people watching these plays, the kingdom would become morally debased. So they would teach them how to basically fall apart morally. Now think about it. We have the word Medea, and Medea was talking about making play after play after play after play until the people lost their morals. Today we have the word called media, and media plays reality TV, where we watch people and then we emulate them. Is there a connection? Possibly. But anyways, looking back at Nineveh, Nineveh was where they were taken and they were held captive, as well as Medea. Now, if we take a look here, this word Yehudi, Yehudi is where we're getting the word Jews. This is showing up mainly in the latter parts of the Old Testament. So if you look, you'll see 2 Kings, Nehemiah, etc. So this is a little bit later into the Bible. As a matter of fact, if you take a look, 1500 BC, that's roughly when the Exodus was out of Egypt. And then 570 BC is when the captivity was. We were looking at some lines from Nehemiah. Nehemiah is near the very end here. So we can see this word Jew was being associated to people after the captivity. So this is what happened. Let's go back a couple slides and take a look at the map. When we have Judah and we have Israel, once the northern kingdom was taken, after the southern kingdom was taken to captivity in Babylon, when they were brought back, everyone was just called a Jew. They didn't know which tribe it was. They couldn't tell if it was, Judah, Simeon, Reuben, Benjamin, etc. Everyone was just called a Jew. As a matter of fact, when we get to the New Testament, we see the same thing. We just see everyone being called a Jew, whether they're from Judah or not. For example, we look at Paul. The Apostle Paul is a Benjamite, and the Benjamite is being referred to as a Jew as well. So basically, just because of their history and how people were kind of all mixed together, the word Jew started being used across the board regarding anyone who was from one of the 12 tribes. So after the captivity in Babylon, the word Jew was applied to anyone living in Judea. So in summary, the word Semite came from Noah's son Shem. The word was originally Shemite, but the Greeks and Romans were not able to replicate the SH sound because of the Hebrew letter Shin. The word Hebrew came from Eber and was first applied to Abraham in the Bible, referring to a son of Eber. The word Israelite was relating to the sons of Jacob. Jacob was renamed Israel in Genesis 32:28. The word Jew came from Judah and initially referred to Judah's children, but following the second captivity in Babylon, came to be used to refer to any of the tribes living in Judea. So now that you have that blueprint, now we start talking about different sections of the Bible. Assuming that you know the timeline we're talking about, you should be able to use these words properly, because we're not going to call someone, for example, from the days of, let's say Noah's son Ham. We can't call Noah's son Ham a Hebrew. We can't call Noah's son Ham an Israelite, and we definitely can't call Noah's son Ham a Jew. So you can see now, based on how these words are used, that this is going to be kind of a chronological usage of these terms. So now we're going to get to the core of our study. The core of our study today is a study of Egypt and the biblical overlaps. So it's one thing to read the history in the Bible and that the Jews were in Egypt. We should be also able to look in archaeology and into history outside of the Bible and find if, in fact, were there actually Jews in Egypt. Egypt then and today. So if we take a look, Egypt was split. We can see there's a lower Egypt and an upper Egypt. So it's a little bit different than what you would expect. So closer north, you'll see Lower Egypt. That's in the upper part of Egypt. And then you'll see that the lower part of Egypt, where it says Nubia, that's actually considered the upper. So it's a little bit reversed from what you would think. So Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt were divided by the Nile River. And then you can see that there were ancient cities and modern cities, and both meaning that they still exist. So ancient cities, Heliopolis, it doesn't exist today, but we know where it is. Memphis is another example. Saqqara was another example. Thebes, Elephantine, the ones that show up in the Bible. Thebes, I'm pretty sure Thebes is in the Bible. Heliopolis, and that's it from this map. These aren't the cities that were necessarily built by the Jews. I will cover those very shortly. Heliopolis was, but we'll get there in just a moment. Exodus 1:1 is where we see what cities the Jews built. And he placed supervisors of the works over them that they might afflict them in their labors. And they constructed fortified cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, Ramesses, and On. So On is also known as Heliopolis. So on the last map we just looked at, we were seeing one of the cities that the Jews had built. That was Heliopolis. Let's look at the other two. So we've got On is Heliopolis. We've got Ramesses, which is the second city they built, and then Pithom. So these are the three cities. Interestingly enough, though, Heliopolis is also known as the city of On. In Egyptian, the city was known as the Pillars, or in Greek, Heliopolis, which is the city of the sun. So the Egyptians, this is Pillar City. To the Greeks, city of the sun. So there's obviously a connection between the pillar and the sun. The major surviving remnant of Heliopolis is the obelisk of the temple of Ra Atum, erected by Sensret of the 12th dynasty. So the obelisks that you're seeing, which you'll find in a quote you'll see up ahead, the obelisks were all dedicated to the god Ra. So the god Ra in Egypt was the reason for these obelisks, these standing stones. Helios, the personified and deified form of the sun, was identified by the Greeks with the native Egyptian gods Ra and Atum, whose principal cult was located in the city. Okay, so if we're speaking to a Greek, the Greek god is going to be named Helios, where the Egyptian version of the god is going to be named Ra or Atum. And then you'll see later in time, there was this connection where it said Amun-Ra. The city also appears in the Old Kingdom pyramid texts as the House of Ra. So Heliopolis, the city of On, was also known as the House of Ra. If we take a look at the map here, so we've looked at Ramses, we've looked at Pithom, we've looked at On. Another place I wanted to point out was Baal Zephon. Baal Zephon wasn't too far away from Pithom. It's actually mentioned when the Jews are in Egypt. What's interesting, though, is we can see this deity named Baal. Baal we know as a sun god. And look how close Baal is in his worship towards these other Egyptian cities. Exodus 14:2. Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite to Baal Zephon. And again, Baal is a solar god. So if we see solar gods in Egypt, it could likely be that this is just more Baal worship. So this is from archaeology.org. This is called the Obelisks of Heliopolis. It says the mighty stone monuments of ancient Egypt were known as obelisks, a word derived from the Greek obeliskos, meaning skewer or spit, were known in Egyptian as tekhenu, which means to pierce. These monolithic, four-sided, pyramid-top pillars rose high into the Egyptian sky, symbols of the sun god Ra and of sun worship, as well as of the power of the pharaoh and his relationship to the gods. As the center of worship of Ra, Heliopolis at one time boasted dozens of obelisks, only one of which remains in its original position. However, not all of Heliopolis obelisks have been lost. Okay, so archaeology.org tells us when you see one of these standing stones, whether you see it here, or whether you see it in Egypt, or whether you see one of the obelisks moved across the world, all those obelisks originally used to represent the sun god Ra in Egypt and sun worship. So it's quite interesting to see at all of our government buildings, this is what has been brought over. Keep in mind, the American money, for example, it has Egyptian symbolism on it. So to see that the Washington Monument is an Egyptian obelisk, Canada's Parliament building also has an Egyptian obelisk, London has an Egyptian obelisk called Cleopatra's Needle, and the Vatican has an obelisk. Here is the obelisk at the Vatican. It's called Mercutio obelisk in Rome. This obelisk was erected by Ramses II outside the Temple of Ra in Heliopolis. So this isn't a reconstruction. They literally took this from Heliopolis, moved it from Egypt. This used to be dedicated to Ra, and this was built by Ramses II. So this was literally taken from Ramses, Heliopolis, and then moved to the Vatican. It was moved to Rome in antiquity and placed in the front of the Pantheon. In the 1700s, it was placed atop a fountain designed by sculptor Filippo Bergioni. So if we take a look at Ramses II, now keep in mind there's a place in Egypt called Ramses, which the Jews had built. They built that city. It says, he is known as Osmandius in Greek sources, Romanized Osmandius, from the first part of Ramses' regal name. User Matra Sepenera, meaning the Mot of Ra is powerful, the chosen of Ra. So there's no question that the name Ra Messes has the name Ra right in it. So this symbol that was taken and brought into Rome, this is associated to sun worship. So it's very strange that the church puts this front and center in the middle of St. Peter's Square. There's another obelisk that was taken to Rome. It's called Flaminio obelisk, begun by Seti I and completed by his sons Ramesses II. So again, we know this has to do with Ra. This obelisk was one of the first brought to Rome by Emperor Augustus in 10 BC and now stands at the center of Piazza del Popolo. So wait a minute, Emperor Augustus, we know who that is. That's Caesar Augustus. We just studied him a week ago. Caesar Augustus, 63 BC to 14 BC. Augustus was born Gaius Octavius and took on the name Gaius Julius Caesar. On 16th of January 27 BC, the Senate gave Octavian the new title of Augustus and Princeps. Augustus is from the Latin word augere, meaning to increase, and can be translated as the illustrious one. It was a title of religious authority rather than political authority. So this title of Augustus was giving Caesar more power than just being the king. The Caesar was also a religious authority. He was the Pope. Caesar Augustus made Julius Caesar into a deity and started the lineage of Caesars with him. So Augustus came after Julius, and so Augustus was the one who started this tale that Julius Caesar was a god, and then Augustus Caesar would be the son of God, and then all Caesars that would come after Augustus would be sons of God as well. Augustus Caesar closing the Temple of Janus. If we take a look, the Temple of Janus, that's 27 BC. What do we see behind? Well, outside the Temple of Janus, we can see that they have the obelisk in the background. Now remember, Rome was pagan. Rome worshipped a whole bunch of different gods and goddesses. We saw last week that Rome worshipped a sun god. And here we can see the obelisk behind. And of course, what do the Egyptians must have in common with the Romans? Well, it must be sun worship. Because even though that obelisk came from Egypt, we know that the Roman gods can be overlapped with the Egyptian gods. Augustus also stylized himself as Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, meaning Commander Caesar, son of the deified one. So again, since Julius Caesar was deified by Augustus, he's calling himself the son of the deified one. With this title, he boasted his familial link to the deified Julius Caesar, and the use of imperator signified a permanent link to the Roman tradition of victory. He transformed Caesar, a cognomen of one branch of the Julian family, into a new family line that began with him. Since Julius Caesar was God, Augustus was stylized as the son of God, a sun god. It says monotheism from ashes of Julius Caesar. In this post, it's written, the name Divus is equivalent to the Greek Deus. This can be seen in Greek coins. Okay, so let's back up a second here. When we're taking a look at these Caesars, and these Caesars who deified themselves, this word divus that they're using, goes back to the word deus, and we've studied the word deus. We know what the word deus means already. Deus or deus, the term father deus was inherited into the Vedic deus, Pater, or Zeus Pater, in other words, the Roman Jupiter. Vulgar Deus, the god of Christianity in the Vetus Latina and the Vulgate. So in other words, when we look at the Latin Vulgate, the Catholic Bible, the name God is written as Deus because we're talking Dios, but this Deus that we're referring to is the Roman Jupiter. So in other words, in the Catholic Vulgate, the word they used to translate God was referring to a very specific God. And that God was the God that the Romans used to worship. And the gods used to worship the Roman deity Jupiter. But now we're noticing that there's a connection here with the Caesars, where the Caesars are literally making themselves into the son of Deus, meaning sons of Jupiter. So the question becomes, is Jupiter the same god as the Egyptian Ra? We know Jupiter is a sun god. We know Ra is also a sun god. Is it that they are the same? And would that explain why the Romans were grabbing the Egyptian obelisks? Because, of course, it would just be a continuation of the same religion. To answer that question, we have to look at the god Amun. Amun was another god that was worshipped in Egypt, and this was in Upper Egypt in Thebes. If we look at the name Amun, Amun was seen with Ra, and what happened was the names became amalgamated. So Amun and Ra became one god, which was Amun Ra. After the rebellion of Thebes against the Hyksos, which we're going to take a look at today, and with the rule of Ahmose, the 16th century BC, Amun required national importance expressed in his fusion with the sun god Ra as Amun Ra or Amun Re. So sometimes you'll see the word Ra being written as R-E or R-A. It's the same thing. So Amun Ra, Amun Re, same thing, or Ra, Amun, same thing. They merged the two together. The question here is,
33,
do you recognize me? Hang on a sec. Let me just turn off the audio here. I must have had some audio on that slide. So the question is, do you recognize who this is? And the answer is, it's Jupiter Amun. In other words, the Zeus that you would see of the Greeks or the Jupiter that you would see of the Romans looked like this when merged together with the Egyptian deity. So this is actually Jupiter Amun. So to answer the question, did the Egyptians and the Romans have the same god? Well, in the case of Jupiter Amun, absolutely. They just blended the two together the same way they blended Amun Ra together. So now you can see why the obelisk could reside in Rome. If they were worshiping Jupiter in Rome and they're worshiping Jupiter in Egypt, why not bring the architecture with you? And hang on a second, I just have to fix this one slide because I must have had an underlying video here that's kind of messing this up. There we go. Perfect.
This behind me is the altar of Zeus in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin in Germany. It was in a place called Pergamon, which was in eastern Greece, but is now western Turkey. And in the book of Revelation, Jesus Christ says to the church at Pergamon, I know where you live, where the throne of Satan is. And this is it. This is the throne of Satan. This is where everyone came to worship the devil, Zeus, the father of Apollyon the destroyer.
So what he just said is, he said, here we are, we're at the Pergamum altar. It's in Berlin, Germany. It was moved from Greece, ancient Greece. And this altar was supposed to be dedicated to the god Zeus. And he just said, well, Zeus is who Christ identified in the book of Revelations as Satan. And I put the line on the screen so you could see it. And we've talked about this before. So in other words, if we're able to identify Satan in Pergamum, we can identify Satan by any of the names that associate to that same deity. So Zeus was the god worship of Pergamum. So Amun was merged with Ra to become Amun Ra. Jupiter was merged with Amun to become Jupiter Amun. Jupiter was Zeus to the Greeks. The Egyptians worshipped the sun Ra Amun. The Greeks worshipped the sun as Helios. The Romans worshipped the sun as Sol Invictus. All three cultures deified their leaders. The pharaohs were deities. The Greeks had their demigods. And the Caesars, as you've just read, were also deities. Are you noticing here that everywhere that people worship the sun, they thought that they were gods? And you can see here that you can translate these god names between all these different nations. But of course, it makes perfect sense because we know that first what we had was we had the Egyptians, and then later in time we had Greeks conquering, and then the Greeks were conquered by the Romans. So all you're doing is you're just piggybacking off of the previous nation's history, taking their gods and changing their names. But interestingly enough, we can see all these major nations. The Greek kingdom was massive. Babylon's kingdom was massive. The Egyptian kingdom was massive, and so was Rome. The largest empires on the entire planet. They all worship the same God. And interestingly enough, the Christians explain, well, there's a counterfeit. There's a God that's trying to steal worship. And they tracked it back all the way to Sodom and Gomorrah. And interestingly enough, here we can see that every major nation that has ever ruled across this planet, they were all worshiping the same God. So to the Christian, they say, well, that's Satan. Satan taught man that he is a god. His symbol was the sun. In the Bible, he often appears as Baal. Remember, Baal is a title, it's not a name. So if we say Baal, that could be Jupiter. Baal could be relating to Zeus. Baal could be relating to Indra or any other names that the sun god went by. The Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans share many of the same gods. So now we're going to take a look at the Egyptian dynasties and the Bible. So now we're going to actually figure out when the Exodus was going on, when Abraham went into Egypt, when Joseph went into Egypt. What were those time frames? So let's start with the Egyptian dynasties. So we've got dynasties going from 1 up to 30, and then after that, it gets taken over by a Greek and Roman rule because the Greeks and Romans took over Egypt. So we had the first dynasty was called the Early Dynastic Period, or EDP. Those were the first 3 dynasties of Egypt. So Egypt started around 2950 BC, and it lasted to the 3rd dynasty of 2575 BC. Then what started was the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom were the dynasties 4th to 8. That was 2575 BC to 2150 BC. Then the next period was called the First Intermediate Period. That was dynasties 9 to 11. And I will point out, as you'll see on another chart, some of these dynasties had some overlap. So they weren't perfectly linear. Some had overlaps. So 2150 BC to 1975 BC. Next, we have the Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom were dynasties 11. 11 was kind of split weird a bit. 11 to 14. And that's 1975 BC to 1630 BC. Then we have something called the Second Intermediate Period, which are the 15th to 17th dynasties, the New Kingdom, the Third Intermediate Period, and then the Late Period. And then the Late Period was really the last Egyptian dynasty because after that it was taken over by the Greeks and then by the Romans when the Romans conquered the Greeks. And as a matter of fact, if you take a look, you'll see 332 BC. Well, Alexander the Great was supposed to be doing his conquests in 333 BC. So these dates are pretty accurate. So here is a more linear graphical method of looking at the exact same thing. So your 3rd to 6th dynasties, that's your first block, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, Intermediate Kingdom, and then New Kingdom. We're going to actually place Israel and find out when they were in these kingdoms, when we had Abraham, when we had Joseph, and we're going to plot this all out. So the Egyptian dynasties. Early dynastic period. This is the first 3 dynasties. Even before the early dynastic period, Egyptian records indicate that there were Egyptian rulers who unified Upper and Lower Egypt. This period saw a surge in writing and administrative organization and even the first attempt at pyramid building. By the end of this period, the cultural hallmarks of classical Egypt were already visible. So this is way before Moses, or this is way before the Exodus. The pyramids were actually built long before the Jews had ever entered Egypt. The pyramids were not built by the Jews. The Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom are the 4th to 8th dynasties. So 2575 BC to 2150 BC. The best known accomplishments of this period were the pyramids, particularly those at Giza. So the 3 pyramids at Giza, the ones that point to Orion's belt, those pyramids were built during the 4th to 8th dynasty. The pyramids were built during the 4th dynasty early in Egyptian history. They bear witness to an amazing administrative and technical ability. Many of the finest sculptures of the Old Kingdom also come from the 4th dynasty. Succeeding dynasties became weaker, and the rulers of the 7th and 8th dynasties are not clearly identified. So if you look at the chart at the bottom there, you can see, for example, the 3rd to 6th dynasties had great overlap with the 7th to 11th dynasty. And if you take a look at the 15th dynasty, the 14th, the 16th, and the 17th were all overlapping at the same time. So as I mentioned, they're not necessarily perfectly chronological. They overlap with each other. The first intermediate period. So now we're looking at the 9th to 11th dynasties. The first intermediate period began with a new set of rulers who reigned from Heracleopolis rather than Memphis. The rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties ruled at the same time but in different areas. Records are sparse from this period, but it was likely toward the end of this time that Abraham visited the Egyptian delta, interacting with a pharaoh of the 10th dynasty. Okay, so now we're actually starting to see some overlap with the Bible. So once we get to the first intermediate period, we're talking the 9th to 11th dynasty. This is when we start to see, okay, this is where we see people from Canaan come into the land of Egypt. Genesis 12, 10 to 14. This would be around that time. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, "Look, I know you are a beautiful woman, and the Egyptians see you. They will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so I will be treated well for your sake. And on account of you, my life will be spared." So when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful. And when Pharaoh's officials saw Sarai, they commanded her to him, and she was taken into the palace of Pharaoh. So this was supposed to happen during the dynasties of 9th to 11th. So this is during the first intermediate period. This is the first time we see any kind of activity from the Bible overlapping with history, at least with Egypt. The Egyptian dynasties. So now we're going to look at the Middle Kingdom dynasties 11 to 14. That's 1975 BC to 1630 BC. King Mentuhotep was the 11th dynasty, defeated the 10th dynasty, and reunited Egypt around 1975 BC. This ushered in the prosperous and powerful 12th dynasty. During this time, the armies campaigned numerous times south to Nubia, and traded with the north extended as far as Byblos. The activities of Joseph, including his scheme for shifting the ownership of the land to Pharaoh, fit well in this period. The 13th dynasty is sometimes assigned to the second intermediate period, as it was an unsettled time when some 70 kings came and went in 150 years. So this is where we're seeing now Joseph getting ownership of the land of Egypt. This is when he was in charge of the land in Genesis, and you see him basically taking money from the people in the land, taking cattle from the people in the land, taking their property so they can stay alive during this famine. So Genesis 47, 20 to 21 is what we're looking at here. So Joseph bought all of the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude, from one end of Egypt to the other.
Now, this is a satellite image of the area, and you can see two villages. This one is called Kantia, up here, a large village, and down here is a tiny little village called Teledaba, and here, this semicircle here is the remains of what we call a tell, or a mound, a ruin mound of an ancient city. But it's the last remnants of it, because this region has been heavily cultivated, and where most of the city has been dug away for farming. So most of the city is invisible. But if I show you what it used to look like in the ancient times, it'll give you a much better impression. Now what's happened is the archaeologists here dug 800 drill cores into the ground in this whole region. And they worked out where the river was, and where the towns were, and where the marshlands were, and where the fields were. And we get this. The ancient Pelusiac branch of the river flowed through this region, and it's now completely disappeared. And around it were these things we call turtlebacks, which are sandy mounds, little islands. Now it's on these islands, these turtlebacks, that the city was formed. This is very complicated, but the city of Ramesses, up here, this pink area, that's all the 90th dynasty city of Ramesses II, And this is the southern district of Ramesses, but earlier we have the city of Avaris down here. So the southern quarter of Ramesses was built on top of the older city of Avaris. The city itself has disappeared. It took us 200 years to work out where Ramesses was because we found little bits of statues lying in the ground like this. All the temples and the blocks and the statues were moved to another location by the Egyptians, leaving just these little fragments. Further south, where the Austrian mission are digging today, and have been, as I say, since the 60s, we get a very different terrain. They only have to dig down less than a metre, and they come across the remains. All the rest of it has been dug away by the farmers and turned into fields. So we just have the foundations of the city lying just beneath the surface. The excavation team is led by Manfred Bietak, who is a very famous Austrian archaeologist, and he's the one that found no evidence for the Israelites in Goshen. So if we look at a cleaned up map here, this is Avaris in blue here, these areas here, with the river flowing, splitting in two at this point. Ramesses does not exist at this time. And we're going to look at three things. First of all, the 12th dynasty palace and temple. That's the heart of the city, if you like, where the royal family used to live in the summer. And then there's a palace of a vizier over here. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. And then there's the main settlement of what we call the Semites or the Asiatics, the people from Canaan. This area here was completely filled with dwellings and graves of these foreigners living in Egypt. This reconstruction shows you what part of the city looked like. Here you see the palace of the king and the temple on the edge of the river here, on the east side of the Pelusiot branch of the river. And here's the Egyptian quarter and then the Semitic quarter up here. This has been reconstructed from what we know of the site today. And in fact, it extended further across the river as well, so it is one of the biggest cities in the ancient world. Something like 30,000 people lived in this city. And for the ancient world, that's enormous. Here's our little temple and palace, summer palace of the king, the residence where he would come in the summer months to go hunting and fishing. And it's in this spot right here. If you want to believe the story, it's where Moses floated with his little basket and settled in the reeds for the princess, the Egyptian princess, to pick him out of the water and take him into the royal palace. This is how it looked. This is how it was. Today, of course, it's a complete and utter mess. This is actually what's left of the excavations of the main settlement, the Asiatic settlement, that the Austrians have dug in the 1960s. This is how it's overgrown now. And this is at the place called Tel Edaba, the mound of the hyena in Arabic. And if I show you what it looked like during excavations, you'll see the work that's gone on here in this part of the site. Digging right down to the lowest levels, finding out when the city was founded, and what happened to the city throughout its history before its abandonment at the top level here, where the village is today. So, it's the Middle Bronze Age city of Avaris. This is the only real candidate for the era and location of the Israelite sojourn as handed down in the biblical tradition. We're going to now look at what this site can reveal to us about the Israelites. This is a picture of two Israelite graves. The one on the right has not been fully excavated yet, and the one on the left there has been dug down to where the body was. The bodies are laid on their sides, usually facing towards the east, in a semi-flex position, semi-fetal position, knees tucked up into their chest. This again is not an Egyptian practice. Egyptians, as you know, I'm sure you know, are laid out in their coffins like this, or if you're a king, like that. Ordinary folk were not buried on their sides in Egypt, not Egyptians. The people who buried on their sides were always people from Canaan, from the north. And in the tomb, you find pottery usually, and that pottery tells us where that culture came from, what type of culture it was. And what we know from the artifacts is that these things, which are called duck-bill axes, or axe heads, because they look like the bill of a duck, they are Middle Bronze 2A Canaanite weapons. They come from Canaan. And the storage jars are also Canaanite. They're not Egyptian either. And these little ungent jars here, they're only small like this, piriform in shape. They are typical Canaanite vessels as well. They're not Egyptian. So everything about this culture that we get out of the graves tells us that these people are not Egyptian, they're foreigners from the north. Look at this very waterlogged grave, small grave. Lots of pottery that we know is typically from Canaan. And then this strange thing here, which I shall just clean up for you and show you what it really looks like. Here's a beautiful bronze belt worn by a chieftain figure. So I want you to imagine an Asiatic or a Semite in his long gown with his magnificent bronze belt around here, sporting a very fine set of daggers. These are typical Middle Bronze Age daggers from Canaan, with a ribbing that you see on the blade, ivory handles, gold rivets, and bronze as well. So beautiful weapons. A rich people, not an impoverished people, a wealthy tribal people from Canaan.
So this, what you were looking at there with Avaris, that was during the Hyksos dynasty. If you take a look near the bottom, you can see where it says Hyksos 15th dynasty. The Hyksos dynasty was the foreign Egyptian dynasty. So the Hyksos were not from Egypt. People have speculated who the Hyksos are. There's two popular theories that I've heard. One being that people thought the Hyksos were the Israelites. I don't believe the Hyksos are the Israelites. I believe the Hyksos are actually the Edomites. But either way, they were foreigners and they were running Egypt at that period of time. As a matter of fact, there's very little information about the Hyksos because the Egyptians were so upset at the fact that basically foreigners had come in and ruled their land that they tried to basically get all that history, done away with. The dynasty that followed was the second intermediate period. That's dynasties 15 to 17. The second intermediate period was a time of weakness and turmoil in Egypt. So you can see here, since it was a time of weakness, this is what eventually led to this conquest. It is difficult to determine how many kings ruled during the 14th to 17th dynasties. Several of them appear to have been contemporaries of each other. The rulers of the 15th and 16th dynasties were Asiatic foreigners from the north, known as the Hyksos. So Asiatic foreigners from the north, they were definitely Semites. We know that as well, which is why this could have been either A, Israel, or B, it definitely could have been Edom or anyone else who's a Shemite. Their capital was Avaris, Teladaba, on the eastern edge of the delta, where numerous non-Egyptian finds have been discovered. This site is one of the candidates for the city of Ramses, which the Israelites built in Exodus 1:11. Avaris was abandoned toward the end of the 18th dynasty, coinciding with the early proposed date of the Exodus. So this is when we start to see a lot of the overlap from the Bible here. As a matter of fact, it looks like because it's very rare to see Egyptians give people positions of authority that are foreign. So it's most likely that when Joseph was brought to power in Egypt, it was likely that this was during the dynasty of the Hyksos, because the Hyksos were foreigners themselves. So it makes sense that the Pharaoh that Joseph was gaining the approval of was a Hyksos ruler, because he had no problem taking a foreigner and elevating him. Genesis 47:20-21. So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh, the Egyptians, one and all, and sold their fields, because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude, from one end of Egypt to the other. Then the next dynasty was called the New Kingdom. New Kingdom was 18 to 20. So that's 1539 to 1075. Sometime around 1539 BC, the 18th dynasty, Pharaoh Ahmose defeated the Hyksos and expelled them from Egypt. Egypt rose to prominence once more as its kings exerted control over lands to the north and south. The most powerful Egyptian king, Thutmose I, made repeated campaigns to the north, reaching as far as the Euphrates River. Hapushah belongs to this dynasty, as do the heretic King Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, and the boy king Tutankhamun, so King Tut. The New Kingdom also produced the earliest known extra-biblical references to the Israelites. For example, the Mern-Ta stele, which dates from 1209 to 1208 BC, records an Egyptian victory over a people called Israel in the land of Canaan. Less well known are several inscriptions that mention a people group called Shashu of Yahweh. This is the Mern-Pa stele. Again, 1213 BC, 1203 BC, somewhere around that area. The text is largely an account of Murtapa's victory over the Libyans and their allies, but the last 3 of the 28 lines deal with a separate campaign in Canaan, then part of Egypt's imperial possessions. The stele is sometimes referred to as the Israel Stela because a majority of scholars translate a set of hieroglyphs in line 27 as Israel. Alternative translations have been advanced but are not widely accepted. There are 3 other stele that contain the name Israel, which are the Misha stele, the Tel Dan stele, the Kirk monolith, but the Mernapa stele was the first. So this was the first place ever anyone had seen the word Israel written down. So Israel, as we remember, that's Jacob. Egyptian dynasties, 3rd intermediate period, tip. That's dynasties 21 to 25. That's 1075 BC to 715 BC. The first intermediate period began with a new set of rulers who reigned from Heraclius rather than from Memphis. The rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties ruled at the same time, but in different areas. Records are sparse from this record, but it was likely toward the end of this time that Abraham visited the Egyptian delta interacting with the pharaoh of the 10th dynasty. Late period, that's 26 to 30. The 25th dynasty was Nubian, while the 26th dynasty was the last dynasty composed of native Egyptians. The 27th dynasty were Persian kings who had conquered Egypt, while the short-lived 28th to 30th dynasties were unsettled and witnessed the end of the dynastic Egypt. For information about a Jewish community living at Elephantine in Upper Egypt in the 5th century, see these articles, Elephantine Papyri. Elephantine is important because, of course, when you take a look at Jeremiah, you'll notice in the book of Jeremiah, they're worshiping a goddess that was called the Queen of Heaven. When we researched the Queen of Heaven pointed back to Egypt. This was an Egyptian goddess. Here we can see that there's Jews living in a place called Elephantine, and Elephantine is in Egypt. The Elephantine Papyri. Also important is the fact that the Papyri document the existence of a small Jewish temple at Elephantine, which possessed altars for incense, offerings, and animal sacrifices as late as 411 BCE. Such a temple would be in clear violation of Deuteronomic law, which stipulates no Jewish temple may be constructed outside of Jerusalem. Okay, so if there were Jews that were living in Elephantine, and there were Jews that were performing sacrifices, and they had incense, remember, this was no different than what the Northern Kingdom did. Northern Israel decided that it was too much of a walk to come down to Southern Israel and Judea and do their sacrifices. And that's why at areas like Bethel, they had set up a golden calf. Well, here we're seeing the same thing. In Elephantine, they had set up a temple, and they're doing sacrifices and offerings in the temple. Well, this is forbidden. This is a breaking of the Deuteronomic law. Here's something interesting we find, and I thought it was important to first point out that the Jews in Elephantine had already broken laws that were set out in Deuteronomy. But this is going to actually explain some of what happened. The texts were written by a group of Jews living at Elephantine near the Nubian border, whose religion has been described as nearly identical to the Iron Age Jehudite religion. The Papyri describes the Jews as worshiping Anat Yahu, mentioned in document AP 44, line 3 of Cowley's numbering. Anat Yahu is described as either the wife, sacred consort of Yahweh, or a hypostasized aspect of Yahweh. So here we can see what the problem is. The Elephantine Jews, they are worshiping a different god. And this god had a consort. Now, there's nowhere in the Bible that says that God has a wife. Now, what happened was, since the Jews were surrounded by other nations and they kept going towards their gods and away from their gods and switching up the God of Israel, it ends up confusing historians because, of course, when historians look back at this, they can see that the Jews worship the god. They can see the Jews worship the goddess. At some points in history, the Jews worship a god and a goddess. And then sometimes in history, we can see that God has a wife. This is happening because, of course, with the Jews worshiping multiple gods, there's a blurring of gods. And when one god blurs with another god, it ends up making it look like God as a wife.
You're looking at the heart of biblical Israel, along the route known as the Way of the Patriarchs. This is ancient Shiloh, the place where the Bible says Joshua divided the promised land between the 12 tribes, and where the tabernacle of the Lord stood for more than 300 years.
Welcome to ancient Shiloh. This is the first capital of ancient Israel, and it's a sacred spot because the Mishkan was here, the tabernacle where people came to connect with God.
Scott Stripling directs the excavation here, and along with dozens of volunteers, they're digging into history.
We're dealing with real people, real places, real events. This is not mythology. The coins that we excavated today, we're talking about coins of Herod the Great, Pontius Pilate, Festus, Felix, Agrippa I, Agrippa II. The Bible talks about these people. We've got the image right there.
That image includes a fortified wall built by the Canaanites. They're finding a treasure trove of artifacts, including coins and 2,000 pieces of pottery a day.
Now this one was from yesterday. It's been washed already, so you see the same form right out of the ground and yesterday, and these are those handles from the stone vessels. Remember Jesus' first miracle at Cana, they were stone jars full of water. That's that ritual purity culture of the first century.
An archaeologist looks at these shards as a fine timepiece.
Just like your great-grandmother's pottery is different from your pottery that you're using today. And once we learn the pottery, then we can use it as our primary means of dating.
Stripling says literally digging into the Bible can change your life.
You can read the Bible, you can walk the Bible, but the ultimate is to dig the Bible. You know, when we actually get into the soil, like these students from Lee University, they're literally, it's under their fingernails and in their nose and their mouth and their ears, and they're exposing this ancient culture. It becomes one with you. And sort of like we came out of the soil, and as we dig into this soil, we connect with God and with each other, I think, in a very important way.
I love getting my hands dirty. I love digging in the dirt. It's my favorite thing.
People from all ages man the dig, with the main drivers being students like Abigail.
It's tiring and exhausting, but it's really rewarding. It's exciting to find ancient things that have been laying in the dirt just waiting for us for thousands of years.
She says the Bible comes alive in the dirt.
I read the Bible totally differently than I did before I came here, and when I read the Bible, I know the places, I know what's going on, I understand it more deeply, especially where previous archaeologists have claimed that the archaeology disproves the Bible, but when we dig here, we find that everything matches. You read it in the Bible, you dig in the dirt, and there it is.
Archaeology doesn't set out to prove or disprove the Bible. What we want to do is to illuminate the biblical text, the background of the text. So to set it in a real world culture, to what we call verisimilitude. So we get an ancient literary description. Now we have a material culture that matches that. Chris, you're sitting where Samuel and Eli and Hannah and these people that we have read about, they came just like us, needing answers, needing to connect with God, needing forgiveness.
He says they dig into the past and find lessons for the present.
One of the faith lessons for us is that God is the potter and we're the clay. And even if our lives are broken, like these vessels are, God told Jeremiah, after he told him to go to Shiloh and see what he had done, he told him to go to the potter's house and look at a flawed vessel and see how the potter puts it back on the wheel and works out the imperfections. So my faith lesson is this, that yes, we're imperfect, but if we'll allow God, he wants to put us on his potter's wheel and he wants to make us a vessel of honor.
Stripling often cites Psalm 102 that says, "O Zion, your servants take delight in its stones and favor its dust."
Ultimately, Chris, if the Bible is true, then the God of the Bible has a moral claim on our lives. And as we establish the veracity of the biblical text, I hope that everyone watching will just think about that God loves us and he has a moral claim on our lives.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Shiloh, Biblical Samaria.
So again, when it comes to studying the Bible, you're not reading a storybook, you're reading a book where you can actually find the history of the people, you can find graves, you can find artifacts left behind, ancient cities. It's not make-believe. We looked at the Elephantine papyri, and we noticed that in Elephantine, which was in Egypt, the Jews were sacrificing where they weren't supposed to be doing a sacrifice. So we can already, without even looking any farther, assume that these Jews went apostate because they're breaking their own laws that are written in Deuteronomy. We found that these Jews actually describe God as having a wife. That wife was Anat. So Anat Yahu was described as either the consort of God or as an aspect of God. We know that God doesn't have aspects, a masculine and a feminine. That's how the pagan God operates. We also know that God doesn't have a wife. So what looks like what happened here is that the god Baal was overlapped with Yahweh, or YHWH, the Lord that you see in the Old Testament. Once Baal overlaps with Yahweh, you will always find archaeologists saying that God has a wife, because the Jews, when they started to worship Baal, the archaeologists thought they were worshiping the God of Israel. So the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What you'll find is when you study this god is called Asherah. Asherah is also known as Anat. So when we see Anat Yahu, Anat is also Asherah. It's the same thing. But look at this. It says some biblical scholars, notice it says some. Some biblical scholars believe that Asherah at one time was worshipped as the consort of Yahweh, the national God of Israel. So then obviously if we take a look at Elephantine, Anat is the same as Asherah, right? Because God can't, if we have one God and God has a wife, well, then that means we've just did a translation here. Asherah is Anat. So then if we take a look beneath this under the Canaanite religion, it said Asherah was the first wife of the creator god named El. Later, Baal acquired her as his wife. Okay, so Asherah is not the god of Israel. Asherah is a goddess to the god El, which is Saturn, and then Baal, which could be Saturn or it could be Jupiter, because Jupiter also goes by Baal. So we can see here that if you take Yahweh, if you take God's name, the Lord, and you mix it up because you're following all this pagan worship that's going around Israel, all of a sudden, once you blur the line and Yahweh becomes a sun god, once Jesus becomes the sun, all of a sudden God adopts a wife, because the sun had a wife, which was the moon or the earth. You can see this in the Bible in the book of Judges. In Judges 2:12-13, it said, "And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them." So see, it was the nations that surrounded Israel. That's where they got these gods from. "And they bowed themselves down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger." So right off the bat, if you're asking, oh, I have a friend in another religion, like, is that a big deal? Well, there's only one God. And here we can see that when you worship the gods of these other nations, it provokes God to anger. So yeah, it's a problem. And it says, "So they fortook the Lord and served Baal and the Asherah." So here we can see they weren't just serving one God, they're serving two. But this connects the dots with this idea of God and his wife. In Judges, whatever they are worshiping here, this is where you could overlap the idea of God and his wife, because here we have Baal and his Ashtoreth, which is Asherah. But this isn't the first time this happened. We can also see it in the book of 1 Samuel. This happened repeatedly in Israel. 1 Samuel 7:4. "So the sons of Israel removed the Baals and the Ashereth and served the Lord alone." So here we go. Here's two different times in history we can see that Israel was worshiping a god and a goddess. Then we get to 1 Kings 18:18. He said, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals." So again, here we can see the worship of another god, and you can see that it's a breaking of the commandments. Why? The first commandment is, "Have no other gods before me." What are they doing? They're worshiping the Baals. Okay, so they've broken a commandment. "Now then send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." So here we can see this is when Israel went apostate under Ahab, and Ahab had his wife Jezebel. But notice this, again, you see Baal and Asherah, they're together. This concept of God having a wife or Baal having a wife, yeah, that exists in the pagan religion. It doesn't exist under the God of Israel. When you blur the two together, that's when you have some scholars thinking that God is a wife. If you assume that God is Baal, then God is a wife. Hosea 11:2. "The more they called them, the more they went from them. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to idols." So again, totally different book, another point in time. Again, Hosea, They're doing sacrifices to the Baals. So we're looking all throughout Israel's history, from the point that they were in Egypt, from the point that they were in the Exodus in the wilderness, from the point that they had made it to the promised land, all the way to the New Testament. They keep worshiping other gods, a god and a goddess. Jeremiah 7:9. Will you steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and offer sacrifices to Baal, and walk after other gods that you have not known? So Jeremiah is the prophet that comes in and says, hey, stop doing what you're doing. And then what happens? They get taken into captivity. So that was the second captivity in Babylon. And what's the consistent factor here? Baal keeps showing up in all these verses where Israel goes in the wrong direction. Amos 5:26. You also carried along Succoth, your king, and Kayun, your images, the star of your gods, which you made for yourselves. So now we see in the book of Amos, here's another example. It doesn't say Baal here, it says Succoth and Kayun. Kayun is the planet Saturn. And then it says the star of your gods. Well, there's only one star that they're referring to, the six-pointed star that you see today on Israel's flag. There is no explanation for the star on Israel's flag, aside from the fact that it came from a surrounding nation, because that exact same star shows up in the Hindu religion long before the Jews ever used it. Jeremiah 11:13. For your gods are as many as your cities, O Judah. So now we're talking about the southern kingdom, right? The northern kingdom went apostate. They sent up this golden calf, and then they got captured by Assyria. Now we see the southern kingdom. What are they doing? They've got as many gods as the northern kingdom. And as many as the streets of Jerusalem are the altars. You have set up to the shameful thing, altars to burn incense to Baal. So again, we're seeing that this worship of Baal, this worship of Asherah, also known as the Queen of Heaven, it's not a good thing. It's a bad thing. And we know that Baal is associated to the sun. And we can see Baal all the way back in Egypt, and Baal was identified as Ra. Romans 11:1-10. So we looked at the Old Testament. You got to ask yourself, if Baal was worshipped and Asherah was worshipped all the way to the end of the Bible in the Old Testament, don't you think that Baal would still be worshipped in the New Testament and maybe today in 2021? It says, I ask then, did God reject his people? Certainly not. Let's figure out who's talking first. If this is the book of Romans, we know this is Paul writing an epistle, and an epistle is a letter. So Paul is writing a letter to the Romans, and the Romans are Gentiles. They're not Jews, right? So I asked them, did God reject his people? Paul's saying, did God reject the Jews? Certainly not. I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people, whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scriptures say about Elijah, how he appealed to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and they are seeking my life as well. And what was the divine reply to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In the same way, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. If it is by grace, then it is no longer by works. Otherwise, grace would be no longer grace. Right here, we can see this statement that's being made in Romans. He's alluding to something that happened in the past. He's talking about this situation with the prophet Elijah and the situation with the Baals. And we've studied this before, where the Baals came out and they were supposed to perform a sacrifice. And the idea was they would have the altar just automatically lit on fire, right? They would call upon their God's name and the altar would become ablaze. And we know the Baals, they were not capable of doing it. But Elijah was the prophet that was able to cause the altar to go into a blaze, and they proved that their God was the true God. And then all the prophets of Baal were slaughtered. So here we can see that this conversation that's being had is talking about the Jews of today, because he says, I asked then, did God reject his people? He's talking about the Jews. So this conversation, the context is that Paul is talking to the Gentiles about the Jews being rejected by God. And then Paul goes into the idea of, well, in the Old Testament, there's something similar going on with the prophet Elijah, where the people of God were bowing down to Baal. And then we see in verse 5, he says, at the present time. there's a remnant chosen by grace. If there's a remnant chosen by grace in the present time and you're referring to the past when they worship Baal, what you're alluding to is the idea that presently still there is worship of Baal throughout the land. And then it says in 7, what then? What Israel was seeking, it failed to obtain, but the elect did. The others were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, ears that could not hear to this very day. Okay, so then when the people had rejected their own God, what kept them blind? God kept them blind. So since God was being rejected by his own people, Israel, what did he do? He allowed them to fall into a spirit of stupor. He allowed them to stay blind. And David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution to them. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see, and their backs be bent over forever. Paul is talking to the Romans about the Jews who rejected God for Baal in the days of Elijah, but Baal is still being worshipped in the New Testament. Acts 7:42 to 43. But God turned away from them and gave them over to the worship of the host of heaven. As it is written in the book of the prophets, did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You have taken along the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Raphan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore, I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. Now, let's look at the context here. This is the book of Acts. But the book of Acts is talking all the way back around the Exodus, because in the Exodus is when they were in the wilderness. And Stephen is pointing out that in the wilderness, was Israel doing sacrifice to their own God, or were they sacrificing to something else? And if you remember from the book of Leviticus, there was the line that said Israel was sacrificing to goat demons. So here we can see Stephen is addressing that, except he's addressing it when? In the New Testament. So who is Stephen speaking to? The Sanhedrin. What's the Sanhedrin? It's the courts. It's the Jewish courts. So Stephen is speaking to the Jewish courts, and he's alluding to something that happened back in Exodus, as if he's pointing towards the Sanhedrin and saying, hey, you guys are doing the exact same thing that our ancestors did way back in the wilderness. Because when you think about it, when Christ was crucified, what happened? Well, it had to do with, there was Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot betrayed Christ. Then Judas brought Christ to the Romans, and the Romans took him, and they were the ones that crucified him. But first, what happened? You saw the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees. There was that conversation where Christ is being pushed around, and they're basically interrogating him. So the Sanhedrin's the court. So keep in mind that if the court had decided that Christ needed to be crucified, they were the ones who decided he was guilty. Well, then they must have had another God, because they rejected the God that was right in front of them. So here's Stephen speaking to that same group and saying, hey, look, remember when we were in the wilderness? Yeah, you were sacrificing to this other God. These were the goat demons. So this is alluding to the fact that in the present, when Stephen is speaking, the Sanhedrin is doing the same thing as their ancestors did back in the wilderness. And so we see the name Moloch, and we see the star of your god Raphan. And we know that that star is the six-pointed star, which we saw in India. Israel worshiped Baal and Asherah so frequently that historians have blurred Yahweh with Baal. This is why some scholars, remember, it's some, believe God has a wife. Again, if you are confused and you think Yahweh equals Baal, well, then God has a wife. If you're able to distinguish and see that sometimes the Jews worship Yahweh, sometimes the Jews worship Baal, well, then you'll realize that Yahweh and Baal are separate, which means that when you're confused, you blur them, God has a wife. When you separate them, you know that they are two separate entities. It was just that Israel was getting confused in their worship. In the New Testament, the names Babylon, Artemis show up in place of Asherah. So we don't see the name Asherah in the New Testament. Instead, we see Diana of the Ephesians. As a matter of fact, in the book of the Ephesians, when they go to that city, all the people start screaming, Artemis is great, Artemis is great. And they would make these little silver idols to Artemis. Now, when you're dealing with silver, silver is associated to the moon. So we know that Artemis was the same goddess that was this goddess worship in the Old Testament. So we'll call her Asherah. And then we can see the replacement for Baal is Beelzebub. You can see it in the name. Beelzebub is Beelzebub. So if we look at Ephesians, which is also where we're seeing Artemis Diana, it says Ephesians 6:16, in every battle you will need faith as your shield to stop the fiery arrows aimed at you by Satan. So what do we know about Satan? He's described as having fiery arrows. Remember that. Now on the left-hand side, that's a picture of Beelzebub. That typically looks like what people would think is a devil. He's got wings, he's got an arch, a bow and arrow in his hand, and if you notice, he's got horns on his head like a devil. He looks almost like a gargoyle. So if we take a look at the word Beelzebul, Beelzebul, look at the bottom in the word origin. Word origin, Baal. So what we did was in the Old Testament, we had names like Baal, we had names like Shamash, we had all these different names for the sun god. Then when it comes to the New Testament, we see Beelzebul. Then we look in Matthew 12:22-24. Then one possessed with a demon was brought to him, blind and mute, and he healed him, so that the blind and mute man both spoke and saw. All the people were amazed and said, is he not the son of David? But when the Pharisees, remember when we look at the Pharisees, we'll see the Sanhedrin too, but when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this man does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. So what are the Pharisees saying? The Pharisees are saying that Christ is exorcising demons by the works of Baal. When you look at this image here, you can see Beelzebub is Baal-zebub, or Baal. So who is Beelzebub? Well, that's Jupiter. That's Zeus. Well, see how this is all starting to make sense now? When we look at the pictures of Beelzebub, we see exactly what you would expect to look at as a devil. You see the wings, you see the horns on the head, you see the little demons and such, and then you see the bow and arrow. But notice, when we looked at Jupiter, which is Zeus, which is Baal, which is all of what we're studying here, notice how Jupiter has devil horns on his head. Most people don't imagine the god Zeus with horns on his head. Now you can see where they came from. Zeus is Beelzebub. The mighty stone monuments of ancient Egypt known as, oops, I actually have one slide out of place here. So when we look at Beelzebub, this is exactly what you would expect as a devil. If I look at cartoons, movies, this is what people think of when they see the devil. They see someone red, they see someone holding a trident, and they see fire, the horns on the head, and we've already equated this to be who? Well, this is Jupiter Amun, this is Zeus, this is Beelzebub, this is that god that went from Egypt into Greece, or Egypt into Phoenicia, into Greece, and then into Rome. The history completely supports it. But now we can see where this really came from. This is an Oriental religion. Since I said that the Star of David came from India, we should probably look for these symbols of Satan and the devil coming from India. If you've ever seen the movie The Exorcist, you know the movie The Exorcist, they gave you a hint. They showed you that the exorcist, the spirit in the movie The Exorcist came from India. So they told you exactly where the sun devil came from. So who's the sun devil? Well, this is Shiva. As a matter of fact, look at Shiva, look at this symbol of the devil. You can tell it's the exact same thing. Notice how he has hoofed feet. I will show you where the hoof feet came from too. So if we look at Shiva, we see the trident. Now, where did the horns come from? Look on Shiva's head. He's got a crescent moon on his head. That's where the devil horns came from. Now, Shiva, he was also known as Indra. Indra mythology and powers are similar to the Indo-European deities such as Jupiter. So wait a minute, let's put this all together. If Shiva is Indra and Indra is Jupiter, well, guess what? We connected all the dots. We've proven where exactly Satan came from. So we can see Jupiter is no different than Indra, which is no different than Shiva, which is no different than, what's another one we're using? Zeus, which is no different than Baal, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Imagine that. If the devil was actually supposed to control the world, why do you think you notice that every major religion and every major empire, it's the same god? It's always Jupiter. So now look at they call it the devolution. So the de-evolving of Shiva. Shiva started off like this. You see Shiva is sitting on top of this cow, and you see the cow horns, and those cow horns made it on his head as a crescent moon. But behind his head, you can see the sun. So now you can see where you get the symbol of fire from, right? The sign of the devil in the flames, that's the sun. And then, of course, when we're talking about the sun, this is where the color red is coming from, which is why they're making him a red devil. And then the horns are coming from the cow he sits on, which represents the crescent moon, and the trident he held in his hand. So God only has a wife when one confuses Jupiter, Baal, also known as Shiva, for Yahweh. So on one side, we've got Baal. On the other side, we've got his Asherah. But of course, this is the Hindu religion, so we're going to get different names for the two. You can really start to see it when you start to compare what exactly the Israelites were doing and then where the influence came from. So if we take a look at Shiva, notice how Shiva is sitting on top of a cow. We've already studied and we've proven what? We've proved that Jupiter is the same god as the Egyptian Ra. Okay, well, Ra was symbolized as a golden calf. So if we see Jupiter, or in this case Shiva, sitting on top of a calf, we know exactly where the golden calf came from that the Jews were worshiping. It's a symbol of Ra. It's a symbol of Jupiter. It's a symbol of the solar god. Now, he has a wife. If we look at the wife, that became the other character in the New Testament Bible. We called her the whore of Babylon. The whore of Babylon sat on top of this beast. So what ended up being this consort of Shiva in the Hindu religion, this gets translated into the whore of Babylon that you see in the book of Revelations. Notice, she's sitting on a beast, but she's also wearing what? Red. This is the lady in red. This is where you get the whole concept of the pretty woman, the lady in red. It's the whore of Babylon, the one that entices you through lust. And if you notice, you can see the crown, and in her hand, look at, just compare the hands, compare the head. You can see it's the exact same deity. It just got translated from the East and then brought into Rome. So we can follow this religion all through the East. If we look in Egypt, here it is. We see Asherah. Asherah was worshipped in Egypt, and we notice that she's standing on top of a lion. Well, how is that any different than the consort of Shiva? And if I take a look, remember we talked about Mother's Day, we talked about Cybele. Cybele is where Mother's Day was based on the Mag Mater cult. Well, notice, she isn't standing on the lion, but she is seated with the two lions beside them, implying that she is standing above them. So again, it's the same thing. You could call her Isis. You could call her Hathor. You could call her Cybele. You could call her Asherah. She has tons of different names, but these are the same deities being worshipped all over the world. Here's some more images of her. On the left-hand side, this is what she looked like in Acadia. You can tell it's the same thing because, again, she is standing upon the backs of the lions and she's got the crown on her head. If we look on the right-hand side, this is another image of her. And again, you can see she's like a warrior goddess. Well, this matches the Greeks' version of Athena Nike. And Athena was the other one listed as Satan. When Christ said that Satan's throne was in Pergamum, there were two gods worshipped in Pergamum. There were several, but there were two chief. Zeus being number one, which is Baal, that's their sun god. But then here's the other one. And the other one here, this is the goddess. This is Asherah. This is where we're getting Nike Athena, the goddess of victory. But they're still doing this right in front of your face today. The problem is, if you don't know occult symbols and you don't know the Bible's based on reality, you're not looking for something directly in front of you. So during the Super Bowl, they had the courage to basically take the whore of Babylon and have her be the halftime show. So they took Katy Perry and they stylized her to look like the consort of Shiva. So she's on top of the back of the cat, just like she is normally depicted in Hinduism. And just to make it absolutely clear for anyone who knows occultism, look at her shirt. Her shirt represents the flames of the sun. That's the lady in red. As a matter of fact, when you look behind the consort of Shiva, notice behind her head, you can see the sun just like you could behind Shiva. So what this represents, it represents the sun riding on top of the moon. And today you see it as the Virgin Mary standing on the crescent moon. You see that in the Catholic Church. But then they did it again. They did it another Super Bowl. Every Super Bowl they put on these sun and moon shows because you don't know any better. So here we see Janet Jackson, and then we see Justin Timberlake, and this iconic scene where he opened up her shirt. Now, you'll notice that the nipple that's exposed, There's a ring on it, and the ring is the symbol of the sun, which means that she represents the consort of Baal, which represents Justin Timberlake as Baal himself. How do we know? The colors they're wearing. One's wearing green, one's wearing red. And you're thinking, well, what's the big deal? If you look at a color wheel, green and red are opposite colors. This was a clever way of saying black and white, or sun and moon. So then that means that Justin Timberlake represents Shiva. But they did it again. They did it at another Super Bowl, this time with Madonna. Instead of having the two out there, they had the 2 in 1. They had Madonna dressed up like the Baphomet, so they didn't have her consort. So she has one hand up representing the light moon, one hand down representing the dark moon. And if you compare her to the Baphomet, you can totally see that's exactly what she represents. She is the androgynous god. That's why they put the horns on her head. And then here's another example of an MTV performance, this time not at the Super Bowl, this was at the MTV VMAs. If you look on the left, you'll see the artist Pink. Now the artist Pink is doing a Masonic ritual. This is a Masonic initiation. She is blindfolded, she has one breast exposed, and then you'll notice that one pant leg is different than the other. That's representing the Masonic initiation. The candidate stands between two pillars. He is blindfolded. He has one breast exposed and one pant leg rolled up. So again, when you know these symbols, you can see them do this on television. You can see them do this in movies and magazines, and they do it all the time. It's because they realize that you have no clue what their religion is about. That's why in the Bible, their religion is called the mystery religion. They can invoke the rituals directly in front of you. They can even get you intertangled in their own religion, and you don't notice because you don't know your own religion and you don't know theirs. And so if they were mixed together, what difference would it make to you?
This statue here it's a rather noticeable stance. That's called the oblong square stance used in Freemasonry. One leg is bared, as in Freemasonry. Chest is bared, same again as in Freemasonry. And behind him.
So when you look at this image that we're just looking at here, this is again at Pergamum. So Pergamum, this is where Zeus's altar was, Satan's altar. Notice how this particular statue is decorated. One leg is bare, and then only the toga, or whatever the sheet is, it's only half covering him. The other half is fully exposed. That's exactly what we see in Freemasonry. In Freemasonry, we have the exact same setup. We have pant leg up, half a breast exposed, but there's more. Notice behind the candidate, there's a pillar on the left and a pillar on the right. Oops. And again, when you look at this figure is again situated between the pillar on the left and the pillar on the right. So is there an overlap between Freemasonry and the Roman cults? Absolutely, 100%. We already saw when we take the Egyptian god Ra and we translate the Egyptian god Ra, it becomes Jupiter or Zeus because Amun-Ra. So we proved that Zeus's name was Jupiter Amun, and Amun-Ra was a sun god, and Zeus was a sun god. So this is the same god. And so then what they did was they took these needles, these big standing stones, the obelisks, and they moved them from Egypt, and they moved them into Rome. They moved them into London. They moved them into the United States. So then this standing obelisk is actually a symbol for Satan. That's actually all over the world, but it shows exactly where our leadership is operating out of. And it's interesting because, of course, if what I was saying was just complete ridiculousness, you wouldn't see Egyptian symbolism on your money. The last piece I'm going to show you are the 10 most interesting finds in the Bible. And we'll end with that piece. Just bear with me 1 second while I find the clip. Here we go. I apologize about the volume. It doesn't go up too much louder.
Hi, this is Scott Lancer, the Director of Associates for Biblical Research, and we're here today with another exciting episode of Digging for Truth, and we're so pleased that you've joined us today. We are going to be interviewing Brian Wendell, and Brian is the pastor of Island Bible Chapel. He is also the newest member of the ABR staff. And so, Brian, we welcome you. It's good to have you on the show today.
Well, thanks, Scott. It's good to be back.
Very good. Well, Brian, we have a lot of ground to cover today, don't we? Because we're going to be focusing. I love doing these shows. This is going to be the top 10 discoveries in biblical archaeology related to the Old Testament. And so shows like this give our audience a chance to really get kind of the lay of the land, so to speak, but it's the high points. It's the amazing discoveries that are made, but it gives us a sense of how biblical archaeology really relates to our understanding of the Bible, our defense of the Bible as the Word of God. It's historically defendable, and it is an important thing for us to look at the evidence that affirms our faith. So, Brian, we're going to jump right in today, and so we're counting down the top 10 discoveries in biblical archaeology relating to the Old Testament. Brian, just by way of introduction, why did you decide to compile this list, and what's the criteria for those items you've chosen?
Sure. Well, this list grew out of the top 10 list I do each year on the top 10 discoveries each year in biblical archaeology. And then I thought, wouldn't it be great to do a top 10 list of all time? The problem was, as I started into it, there just were too many to choose. And particularly when I had to decide between Old and New Testament. So I said, you know what, we'll just do two lists. And so this is my top 10 list for the Old Testament, and I did another list for the New Testament. And so in order to make this list, here's the criteria I used. First of all, it has to be directly related to a person, place, or event in Scripture, or to the composition of Scripture itself. And second of all, it has to be it has to be related to the composition of the Bible. So what I mean by that is this. So if you got the New ESV Archaeology Study Bible, you would have seen that they have the Rosetta Stone as their #1 discovery of all time in biblical archaeology. Hugely important artifact. It was the key to helping us crack Egyptian hieroglyphics, but indirectly related. And so to narrow my list, I've chosen to keep it directly related to people, places, or events, or to the composition of the Bible.
Very good, very good. Well, we're going to look at your top 10 list, and let's start with number 10 and number 9, and let's just roll right into that. Number 10 has to do with Assyrian inscriptions. So why don't you tell us about that?
Sounds good. And I'm going to cheat a little bit here because I'm going to group Assyrian inscriptions together. And the reason for that is this. They affirm historical details in the biblical text, particularly with regards to the Hebrew kings, but also they help us establish a biblical chronology. In the Bible, we don't have absolute dates given. We have relative dates given. So a prophecy in a certain year of a king. And so because of Assyrian inscriptions, we can now know absolute dates for the Old Testament. This is how it works. The Assyrians had a practice of naming each year after a person, and they called that person the Lemu. And so these are called Assyrian Lemu lists. Yes. And so when they excavated when they excavated at Nineveh, they discovered a number of these tablets that were Assyrian Lemu lists, and put together, they showed us 250 years of Assyrian named years, and then one of them actually named a solar eclipse, which has been dated exactly to June 15th, 763 BC. So instantly, we now have over 250 years of Assyrian chronology absolutely dated. Yes. Then when you compare the annals of the Assyrian kings, in which they mention Hebrew kings, we start to be able to see some interactions between the kings of Assyria and the Hebrew kings. So the Kirk monolith of Shalmaneser III, for example, names King Ahab as one of the kings of a Western coalition who fought against him at the Battle of Kekar. That's dated to 853. We have the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, in which King Jehu is seen bringing tribute to Shalmaneser. That's 841. And so these inscriptions now allow us to date the Hebrew kings. In fact, in his book, The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, scholar Edwin Thiele successfully reconstructed the entire chronology of the Hebrew kings from the book of Kings and Chronicles, and it's all because of these Assyrian inscriptions, and that's pretty spectacular.
It is, and it just goes to show again, these inscriptions are so essential for us connecting all these dots. Well, let's talk about the Cyrus cylinder, a tremendous find.
Absolutely. It's probably one of the most famous artifacts in all of biblical archaeology. It was discovered in 1879 in the ruins of Babylon, and it contains a general declaration by Cyrus the Great in cuneiform script, declaring that he was freeing the exiles to return to their, quote, settlements, and allowing them to take their gods and rebuild their, quote, sanctuaries. And so what we need to understand is that there were more exiles in Babylon than just the Jewish people. There were all sorts of captured people who were in Babylon, and Cyrus let them all go free. Now, in the Bible, what we see is this. We know that the Jews did not have idols. And so the specific announcement for the Jewish people is recorded in Ezra chapter 1, where Cyrus lets the people go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And in fact, verse 7 records that the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem were given back to take back to Jerusalem. Now, here's why this is important. In the 19th century, skeptics used to scoff at the biblical claim that an ancient king would let captured people go free, like the Bible declared. And what we now know is that this was exactly the public policy of Cyrus the Great. So it affirms that detail for us.
Very good. And that was number 9. And number 8 is the Merneptah Stela. Now, Brian, we only have about 30 seconds here. Let's introduce the Merneptah Stela and why it's important.
Sounds good. So the Merneptah Stela is a victory stela from the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, who lived from 1213 to 1203. And the bottom of it, the last 3 lines, we see a phrase that says, "Israel is wasted, its seed is not." And so an amazing confirmation here. We have Egyptians mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Now we have Israel mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions.
Yes. Well, that's awesome. All right, Brian. Well, maybe we can pick up and add a few more details about the Merneptah Stela when we come back. And we're so glad you've tuned in today to Digging for Truth, and we'll be right back. About the top 10 discoveries in Old Testament discoveries in biblical archaeology and of all time. And so Brian Wendell's here with us. And Brian, we know this is going to be the definitive list for everyone else to follow, right? But this is important. And we ended the last segment by talking about the Merneptah Stela. And we want to say a little bit more about that because it's such an extraordinary find.
Yeah, it's a really important find. At the bottom of it, it says, "Israel is wasted, its seed is no more." Of course, Merneptah, the Egyptian pharaoh, is claiming to have annihilated Israel. We know that didn't happen, both from the Bible and from history. They prospered in the land of Canaan for another 600 years. But here's why that's really important in this discovery. First of all, it's the oldest definitive reference to Israel as a nation. It's not the only one, but it's the oldest definitive one that we have. And secondly, it's the clearest reference to Israel as a nation that we have. But the point that I think is really important here is that it is really helpful in helping us understand the dating of the Exodus. See, the Bible would place the Exodus at around 1446 BC based on a number of passages, and I know you've done a previous episode on that. And so, but there are some who would suggest that the Exodus was a late Exodus. It didn't take place till 1250 or 1270 BC. Well, this stela dates to 1210 BC, and there just simply isn't enough time for an Exodus 40 years wandering in the desert, the conquest of Canaan, which took years, and the establishment of themselves as a nation really in the land of Canaan. There just isn't enough time for that to have all happened by the time Merneptah claims to have attacked them. And so really important artifact.
Absolutely. The artifact and the biblical material have to come together, and the Merneptah Stela is so critical for that understanding. Well, let's keep counting down. We're down to number 7, and the Moabite stone. Everyone's heard of the Moabite stone. Well, some people have anyway. Yeah.
Moabite stone is a really interesting monument discovered in Jordan in 1868. It's an inscription recording the acts of Mesha, the king of Moab. It dates to around 840 BC. What's interesting is that it describes the same events that we read about in 2 Kings 3, although it's from the Moabite perspective. And so 2 Kings 3, of course, tells us that Mesha rebelled. Moab had been subjected to Israel, and when a new king came in, Mesha rebelled and was able to throw off the yokes of Israel. And when we read the Moabite stone, we see the same thing described. And so it's important for 3 reasons. First of all, it corroborates the events that are described in 2 Kings 3, even specific details. It records that Mesha was a sheep herder, a sheep breeder, in addition to being a king. It confirms that the primary god of the Moabites was Chemosh or Chemosh, mentioned in the Moabite inscription. And the second thing is, it contains, again, an early reference to Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, because one of the things that Mesha claims to have captured were the altar hearths of Yahweh. We're not really sure what those are, but we're sure that it clearly is referring to the Israelite God. Yes. And the third thing, just really briefly, is that in 1994, Andrew Lemaire looked at it again and reanalyzed it and found a previously indistinguishable letter, which means that that monument may actually say the House of David as well. And so really important, because we're going to talk about that shortly as it relates to David.
Yeah. You know, we really appreciate in biblical archaeology the fact that some of these leaders love to brag about what they did. They carved it in stone. Sometimes I'd like to believe they did that just for us geeks in archaeology. That's for sure.
That's right.
Well, let's move on to number 6, the Jerusalem Chronicle.
Absolutely. The Babylonian Chronicles are a series of clay tablets. They're held at the British Museum, and they recount the history of the kings of Babylon. And so the Babylonian Chronicle for the year 605 to 594 BC records the fall of Jerusalem under King Nebuchadnezzar, hence its name, the Jerusalem Chronicle. It's dated precisely to the event is dated precisely to 597 BC, and this is the second deportation that the Bible records. The first one in 605, of course, was when Daniel and his friends were taken to Babylon, and then in 597, Nebuchadnezzar came back. He destroyed the city. The Bible records that he deposed King Jehoiakim, that he appointed a new king, Zedekiah, who he named Zedekiah, that he took heavy tribute back to Babylon. The Bible says he took the treasures from the temple and the house, the treasures of the kings. And here's the thing, the Jerusalem Chronicle records all of that. All of those details are confirmed on that clay tablet. So just a really important artifact, and it even gives the exact date of the fall of Jerusalem for us as March 16th, 597 BC.
Amen. Very good. Well, Brian, we have about a minute each for number 5 and number 4, and we're into that final 5, which are usually the ones that are most amazing. But let's talk about number 5, Hezekiah's Tunnel.
Hezekiah's Tunnel. If you've traveled to Jerusalem, you may have gone walking through Hezekiah's Tunnel. The Bible records that when Sennacherib was coming to make war on Jerusalem, Hezekiah blocked off the Gihon Spring outlet at the top and channeled the water into the city. 2 Kings 20:20 describes this tunnel that he had built, and they've found the tunnel, including this inscription, this is called the Salome inscription, which describes how the two groups of people digging from both ends came and met exactly in the middle, and describes the moment they met. It dates precisely to the time of Hezekiah in the 8th century BC. And so we have some amazing affirmation of exactly what the Bible describes having been dug. We can go to Jerusalem and we can actually see that tunnel today.
Very good. All right, and let's talk about number 4. I'll let you introduce that.
All righty. This is probably one of my favorites just because it's so spectacular. It's the Lachish reliefs. These are stunning carvings taken from the walls of the palace of Sennacherib, and they describe his siege at the city of Lachish. That's described in the Bible in 2 Chronicles 32:9, when he was besieging Lachish, and he sent word to Hezekiah in Jerusalem saying, "You're next." But what we know from the Bible is that God stepped in and rescued Hezekiah. And so when Sennacherib got back to his palace, all he could brag about really was in his annals that he shut Hezekiah up like a bird in his cage in Jerusalem. Yeah. And so the big, beautiful relief carvings of that battle are of the siege of Lachish, and incredible detail, siege ramps, Hebrew soldiers throwing rocks down and arrows, and just amazing. And here's the interesting thing. Had Sennacherib taken Jerusalem, that would have probably been what he had put on his walls.
That's
but
right.
he didn't.
That's
All
right.
he could do was brag about taking the city of Lachish, and that's what we see.
Very good. Well, thank you, Brian. All right, we'll be back for our last segment in just a moment. Thank you for joining us today on Digging for Truth.
Bible and Seed.
About the Old Testament in biblical archaeology. The Ketef, the silver scrolls, Ketef Hinnom scrolls. Brian, these are have a lot of meaning to those of us at ABR because Gordon Franz, who was a former staff member, was the one who actually had his hands on these and discovered them. And so let's talk about this extraordinary find.
Yeah, amazing. Can you imagine having found these and held them in your hands? They were found in excavations in 1979-80 in some burial caves at Ketef Hinnom. And there were 2 amulets that were little silver scrolls rolled up. And when they unrolled them, they found that they had this text on them. And it turned out to be the priestly benediction of Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. They translated the scrolls and they say, may Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh cause his face to shine upon you and grant you his peace. Now, these date to the 7th century BC. So these are the earliest portion of scripture that we have. They predate the Dead Sea Scroll by hundreds of years. And what's also really interesting and an important part of this find is this. There are those who would suggest that Moses never wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, that they were written by some priests or some other people or a group of people much later, the exile, even the post-exilic period. And what we have now are portions of the scripture that Moses is said to pen hundreds of years before people said the critics said that they were really written. And so it actually helps us to understand that the Bible was written by the people who it says wrote it, and also helps us to see the accuracy with which it was transmitted.
Amen. That's right. Tremendous discovery. Okay, well, let's talk about number 2.
Number 2 would be the Tel Dan Stela.
Yes.
Bible minimalists have asserted King David's empire, as it was described in the Bible, was nothing more than a myth or a legend. One professor said, "I'm not the only scholar who suspects the figure of King David is about as historical as King Arthur." Well, that was all before 1993, because in 1993, at the ancient site of Dan in northern Israel, they discovered this broken stone that on it was an inscription. It was a victory stela, probably from the king of Aram, most likely Hazael, though he's not named, in which he brags about defeating Omri, the king of Israel, and his ally, who is not named but is called the king of the house of David. And so it's sometimes called the House of David inscription. And that was an incredible find, because now we have historical confirmation of David as a historical figure, but more than that, the phrase House of David means dynasty of David. And so the Bible, just as it describes the dynasty that he had, we now have some attestation from an inscription about that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the Tel Dan Stela made such a huge impact, and it ended up closing a lot of mouths. I mean, there were so many people, they were ragging on the Bible. It just, Israel wasn't really what the Bible describes, wasn't a dynasty. This really kind of just kind of moved a lot of that debate and discussion off to the side because this evidence was so strong, and it continues to speak. All right, well, we're down to our number one discovery in the Old Testament discovery. Why don't you tell us about that?
Sounds good. Well, to me, the number one discovery was a no-brainer. It was the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin sheep herder. He sold them to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. Word got out, and they ended up doing excavations. They found over 975 manuscripts, 980 altogether, dating from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD, and 230 of those manuscripts turned out to be biblical manuscripts. Now, before that, the earliest complete Hebrew manuscript we had was from about 1000 AD, the Leningrad Codex. And so what this allowed us to do was to see how much the Bible had changed in over 1,000 years of transmission. And the answer is not very much. We have large portions like the great Isaiah scroll and the great Psalm scroll. And these show us that the Bible was transmitted very reliably, copied very accurately. Holden and Giesler, in their book on the Handbook of Biblical Archaeology, sum it up this way. They said, the scrolls proved to be an important link in the unbroken chain of texts that contributes to establishing the textual reliability of the Old Testament scriptures. I couldn't say it better than that, so I want to just quote them.
Right.
Amazing find.
Amen. Well, in our last minute here, Brian, tell us why, we've looked at all these really cool discoveries. Why do you believe biblical archaeology matters? Why are these discoveries important?
Well, Scott, we live in a world where people have, I think largely in North America and the West here, have written off the Bible as a book of myths and legends. Some dismiss it as unreliable simply because it's a religious book. And I believe these 10 discoveries, just 10 of the hundreds of discoveries that have been made, really show that the Bible is a historically accurate document that's been reliably transmitted over the millennia. And I believe if we can trust what the Bible says historically, we can trust what it says spiritually, because the historical and the spiritual go hand in hand. Because the Bible really is the story of a God who loves us so much, he sent his son, Jesus of Nazareth, a real person, to come and die in our place so that we can have our sins forgiven if we put our faith in him. That is good news, and it's news we can trust.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.